Good morning, everyone. Thanks for attending my confirmation seminar. My name is Zardini, and today we'll talk about my research proposal. And the topic background and motivation for this PhD. After that, I will present a timeline to contextualize my PhD journey and its challenges so far. Then, I will describe the main features of my research proposal. Regarding my main academic qualifications, they are all related to sports and management. In 2009, I started to work for the Brazilian federal government. Before that, I had worked with professional football and public sports entities. And in 2016, I worked for the IPC during the Rio Games. As a researcher, I had the opportunity to have chapters in books and articles published. My main motivation for my research topic came because of my job in Brazil. My true immersion in parasports happened because a former boss of mine who was very engaged with parasports. And during the London and Rio cycles, I had to analyze funding projects for the Brazilian Paralympic Committee. Therefore, because of my job at the government, I was always curious to understand how policy implementation really occurs in national sports organizations. At the beginning of my PhD, my research was also about policy implementation, but related to its impact on international sporting results and proposing a model of analysis. That proposal had some crucial assumptions, such as the end of the Tokyo cycle, with full strategic planning being implemented, and including analysis with the sporting results from the Tokyo Games. However, with the postponement of the Games in March, we had to adjust that proposal with new objectives, research questions, modifying the method, and looking for new references. And during this adjustment period, several online events were followed to form a better idea about the impacts of the COVID-19 on the elite and parasports. But the context to adjust the proposal was very challenging, when I had to control my anxiety, modify my project, and do my job trying to ignore what was going on outside. Basically, we had to demolish previous expectations and embrace new ideas. This is my current research proposal, named Implementation of Elite Parasports Policies, How Interdependencies and Organizational Learnings Shape Processes of Policy Implementation. The presentation of my research has 4 parts. Firstly, I will present concepts and a contextualization from my literature review. Next, some information about the Paralympic movement, particularly about the IPC. After that, a short description of the Brazilian parasport system, including the CPB, that is the Brazilian NPC, and also an NGB for some sports. Then, the objective, research questions, and method of the proposal. So firstly, it is important to consider that, usually, policymakers do not pay enough attention to policy implementation. Implementation that can transform or distort the objectives of a policy, putting at risk potential benefits. Central to the understanding of policy implementation is examination of the factors that can impede or enhance the implementation processes. So, as a first step, we reviewed the literature to better understand these factors. Since last year, we have done an extensive literature review to better understand policy implementation and elite parasports. To illustrate this review, considering the previous versions of the document and the final research proposal, more than 400 references were used. As a result, we realized that there would be too many factors that potentially could be determinants or just influence policy implementation, and we would not be able to deeply cover them all. Furthermore, with the literature being over-concerned with the top-down and bottom-up approaches, and so far, there is no general theory well accepted to analyze policy implementation, we faced a simple question. How could we analyze policy implementation and party sports? So, firstly, we elaborated a diagram to understand macro elements that are related to and affecting policy implementation and elite party sports. It is important to observe that implementation processes can generate two complementary groups of results. Direct outputs from the internal processes, that is, what was actually done by the managers and implementers, and outcomes, that are the impacts produced by the outputs in a society. This research focuses on some elements within this diagram. We will observe the impacts of interdependencies and learning processes on the shape of the process of policy implementation. However, as broad aspects, we will focus on four groups of elements: resource dependency, power relations, administrative legacies from the Paralympic Games, and the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Regarding resource dependency, in context of interdependencies, the control of financial resources can facilitate or constrain policy implementation. For example, governments and NGBs can use funding control to interfere in the governance and management of sports organization. And when an organization depends on resources from another, its autonomy can be reduced. Discretion is another factor that can have an impact on the process of policy implementation, as managers and street-level bureaucrats may decide which rules should be applied and in what context. Power relations can also facilitate or constrain policy implementation, and power relations can be observed through regulations, in a direct way when rules and procedures are imposed on organizations or individuals, or indirectly, as regulations can affect actors that were not the original focus of them. And power can also be exercised through political interference, and this interference can cause practical issues on processes and organizational objectives. Learning processes can also impact policy implementation. Learning can be observed by an organizational learning perspective, that is, a lasting learning transmitted throughout an organization. Organizational learning can occur by an exchange of knowledge between organizations, and these learnings, they can come from new experiences of management that can improve or change internal processes. For example, individuals can acquire sport-specific managerial experiences from mega events that can return as a benefit for a whole organization. A motivation to engage in learning processes occurs in situations when organizations are under conditions of uncertainty, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Under these conditions, organizations tend to imitate each other as they face institutional pressures to follow legitimate initiatives. Some features of the Paralympic movement are important to keep in mind. For example, it is still difficult for countries to offer sports to people with disabilities because of reasons such as limited resources and limited media coverage. In this scenario, governments, they have an essential role to implement policies to fund and develop NGBs and para-athletes. The IPC is the entity that internationally leads the Paralympic movement. Ideally, the NPCs must observe and comply with the administrative and operational guidelines issued by the IPC. Overall, the IPC has not only a direct impact on the NPCs through regulations and funding, but also an indirect impact. For example, when they encourage governance changes in NPCs during official events. It is also important to observe that, for years, the IPC had been transformed more into a sports organization, becoming more about sports than disability. However, with a new president in 2017, the IPC changed its vision, returning inclusion as a major focus of the entity. As Brazil will be the focus of my study, I will present some features of its elite parasports system. The CPB is not only the Brazilian NPC, but also an NGB for 4 different sports. In the federal government, SNEAR has been the entity that is responsible for the elite sports in general. A turning point for the development of parasports in Brazil came in 2001, when a new law imposed that a part of the revenue from the national lottery should go directly to the Olympic and Paralympic committees. This image shows the main national actors funding para-athletes and NGBs in Brazil. My proposal focuses on a small part of this funding system. The importance of public funding is clear in Brazil. For instance, from 2008 to 2016, SNEAR has invested more than 67 million Australian dollars to develop elite parasports. Caixa, that is the federal bank that controls the national lottery, has been the major sponsor of the CPB. However, most of the resources to the CPB and NGBs comes from the national lottery. Receiving public funding, the CPB and the NGBs, they must comply with federal regulations. But the CPB also acts as a regulator and funder using this public funding. For instance, last year, the CPB decentralized less than a third of the resources received from the national lottery to the NGBs. It is also important to observe that since 2009, the CPB has been directing its policies through a strategic planning. But the second version of this planning shows a change in the vision and mission of the entity. For example, the new vision is more focused on management capabilities and inclusion than only having a focus on the development of sports. Different angle, in 2007, Brazil hosted the Pan and Pan American Games. The Games left some managerial legacies for parasports, such as a closer relationship between the federal government and the CPB. And international organizations, they shared knowledge and expertise about how to better conduct internal processes. However, the eventual administrative legacies from the Rio Games and their effect on how high-performance programs are implemented are still unknown. Recognizing the complexities of parasports, of policy implementation, and from the Brazilian sports system, the objective of this study is to analyze managers' perspectives on how organizational interdependencies and learnings have shaped and constrained the implementation process and practices of NGB's elite parasports policies in Brazil. There are several justifications for this proposal. Overall, there is a need for more studies about policy implementation. There is also a need for more studies of how the Paralympic movement works. And more comparative studies within the Paralympic context are also necessary. To identify the gap in the literature from May to December last year, using several terms and combinations, no research in English or Portuguese was found about implementation of elite parasports policies. Organizational learning has also been underexplored in sport management. And the literature of the legacies from the Paralympic Games is still in its infancy, mainly about administrative legacies. We have two groups of research questions. Regarding interdependencies, how do managers perceive funding dependency, political interference, and regulations shaping the NGB's processes of policy implementation? Regarding organizational learning, what were the administrative legacies learned from the Rio 2016 Paralympic Games, and how did they shape current processes of policy implementation? And how are processes adapted because of the COVID-19 crisis, and which adaptations will be incorporated into the strategy of policy implementation? The method will use a multi-case design to find patterns of theoretical importance. Initially, 5 NGBs will be contacted, which corresponds to 7 different sports. But in January, 2 NGBs have already permitted our research. 2 others said it is viable, but there are some bureaucracies to be overcome. And the last one hasn't answered our email. We used a purposive sampling strategy, and as a mixed method, we use quantitative and qualitative data also in our sampling process to ensure diversity of NGBs under investigation. In short, this proposal uses a pragmatic paradigm and has exploratory and descriptive features. Its mixed methods design follows a qual-quant model, that is, more weight is given to the qualitative data. We also use semi-structured interviews and document analysis that will complement each other. The comparison of the cases and the manager's perspectives will be made in terms of similarities and differences. Initially, our goal is to interview 35 managers from 7 sports. However, the final number will depend on the size of the organizations and the saturation of the data. Only managers directly involved with the implementation of the high-performance programs will be considered. The results of the interviews will guide the document analysis and may change the initial framework. The document analysis will provide the quantitative data that will support the analysis of the resource dependency. It will also support the elaboration of the interview guides. It will help to understand the current shape of the internal processes and to contrast or validate the interview findings. This proposal has also some important delimitations. For example, it will only investigate processes of financial support to athletes and coaches, processes related to the provision of training facilities and equipment, and professional training support. We will only investigate processes of national teams and high-performance programs implemented after 2016. An exception is made for the analysis of the Rio 2016 legacies. And by the shape of the processes, we will only observe the following features: the content of analysis of the processes, the flow of the mandatory and necessary decisions throughout the organizational structure, the actors involved, and monitoring and evaluation practices. This is the framework that we will use to understand how processes of policy implementation were shaped by specific organizational factors. To investigate interdependencies, we will observe how funding dependency directly affected the shape of the processes and how it indirectly affected the processes through impacts on the autonomy and discretion level of the NGBs. For this, we will look at the actions from specific stakeholders and their effect on the NGBs and CPB. Regarding relations, we will study the direct and indirect impact of regulations using the concepts of compulsory and institutional power. However, for the analysis of the political interference, we will only investigate the eventual efforts from the IPC and the CPB to change the process of the NGBs, according to the new visions and strategic planning of the IPC and CPB. In political interference, it will be understood as occasions when previous decisions were changed or when agents were prevented from using their best judgment on decision-making processes. Both occasions motivated to favor specific actors, groups, or ideologies through mechanisms perceived as improper. And how eventual administrative legacies shaped the processes will be explored from two complementary perspectives. Firstly, observing their origin in effect, and secondly, observing how they were implemented, using the concepts of bricolage and translation. As the bidding process for the 2016 games started in 2008, it may be challenging for managers to remember some legacies from the games. Therefore, we will initially look for potential administrative legacies related to new types of decision-making processes and structural changes, new quality standards and KPIs, new criteria and content of analysis for funding, and new planning methods. The adaptations, new processes, and practices incorporated due to the COVID-19 pandemic and their effect on the shape of the processes will be analyzed in terms of what and how processes were adapted or adopted, using the concepts of bricolage, translation, and isomorphism. The qualitative data will be analyzed by content and quotation analysis. The comparisons, cross cases, and within cases will be made using different levels of managers, difference between sports, and the perceptions of managers with and without disabilities. Quantitative data will be analyzed by descriptive statistics, mainly observing the types of the financial resources, the raw figures, and the percentages related to the sources of income. Further comparisons will be performed categorizing the NGBs, for instance, large versus small organizations in terms of income. Overall, we expect to unpack factors that are shaping the process of policy implementation of parasports NGBs. We also want to offer to sports managers and policymakers some evidence about the challenges linked to the process of policy implementation, aiming to achieve or maintain success in Paralympic sports. As examples of limitations, we are only observing factors at the national level, but not including the federal universities. Moreover, it is clear that the COVID-19 pandemic may have an effect on the mood and perceptions of the managers. This fact is even recognized in our framework. Even though we plan to collect longitudinal data, the context created by the pandemic may indirectly influence the recent perceptions of the managers. That's all. Thank you. Any questions?